Hi, everybody. Once again, I am kind of sort of back here doing a video for you. If you're watching this on the day that it was recorded or the day after that, then you are a patron. You are supporting this work, and I am so, so grateful. After all these months of my inactivity, dealing with all my health issues and everything else, the fact that you're still there really does mean a lot to me, especially as, well, everybody's time and money and everything else is running short for so many people, so me included. So thank you so much for that. As I get myself healthy again and try to get my mind back on the things that matter the most in the world, but to me as well, um, I'm going to try to get these videos out more frequently. I'm going to try to get my podcasts out more frequently, get the information out there, put myself back out in the public arena, as it were, as I've done for many years. But, here we are. And I just want to say thank you to those of you who have continued to support my work. And if you're finding it now after having previously supported it or whatever, I'm still around. I still really appreciate all the support in the past and maybe even a little bit of the support in the future, if you know what I'm saying. So thank you so much for that. So many people out there on the internet just begging for your clicks, begging for your money, all of that. It's so, so annoying, so frustrating, and really makes you feel pretty negative about just the left in general, the whole social media world, everything else. I haven't even really come back onto Facebook. So for those people who followed me on Facebook, sorry about that. I'm at some point going to again. But I want to get started and talk about what's going on in Sudan. Now, part of the reason I want to talk about it is because, not to use the really horrifyingly cliched phrase, or I guess marketing campaign, but what happens in Sudan doesn't stay in Sudan, or maybe what's happening in Sudan isn't entirely about Sudan. In fact, it's about many other countries, competing agendas, really, really dirty, dirty politics, lots of blood on everybody's hands. And unfortunately, these are the kinds of facts that we need to understand. And hopefully, I'm going to provide you the kind of analysis that you need to really get what the hell is happening in Sudan, this devastated country in the midst of a civil war. So let's talk about that. Of course, my nose starts itching horribly the minute I start recording, but you'll watch me pick my nose, I guess. Anyway, let's say let's ask the basic question: who is fueling Sudan's civil war? And the answer is, well, a lot of different people. Let's talk about that. So I want to highlight a really excellent article that I really highly recommend everybody check out. It came from African Arguments. The headline: How the UAE Kept the Sudan War Raging. And this is full of a lot of excellent, excellent information. And I thought I got the headline, but I guess I didn't. Well, here's the picture from it. That on our right is Hameti. His last name is Dagalo. He is the leader of the RSF. We'll talk about them and where they came from and what they're doing. And the guy on our left there is Yoweri Museveni, longtime president of Uganda, also playing a very critical and pretty dirty role in all of this. So let's discuss that. So this article, it opens on the scene last August of a plane landing in North Kordofan province in Sudan, which is essentially the province right next to Khartoum, the capital and the main city. It's not too far. The plane landed not too far from the city of El Obeid, which is the capital of North Kordofan. Now, this is a strategic city, very important crossroads that links Western Sudan, the region that we all remember, Darfur. We all remember the genocide of Darfur, one of the real humanitarian cause celebs of the early part of the 21st century. Darfur and Western Sudan, they also, and this is going to be important, that butts up against several other countries, including the Central African Republic and Chad, both of whom we're going to talk about. So the point being that this plane lands, and I do have a very short video that we're going to watch, and this is a video that was taken by one of the bystanders as this plane landed. We're going to talk about the plane, where it may have come from, what it was, where it's based, and who operates it. But this Anyway, that goes on and on and on. We're not going to watch 3.5 minutes of that, but that's the video. This video was a major breakthrough in helping to understand exactly what's going on in Sudan. I'm going to talk about the plane in a minute, but let's take a step back and ask who are the major players on the ground. Okay, the war itself is really being fought between two primary factions. It's a little bit more complicated, but two basic camps. One is the Sudanese army, which toppled Bashir, the former dictator, several years ago, was involved in a coup in 2021 that overthrew essentially a transitional government and has basically been in power ever since then. In 2023, the civil war breaks out between the army, which is in control of the government and the nation's institutions, and the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces. Now, if you think back, if you're old enough, now for my younger viewers who maybe don't know about Darfur or don't remember how much that was a story, especially a sort of a fundraising cause for celebrities like George Clooney and others, Darfur was a big deal. Darfur, the conflict, and I'm minimizing it tremendously and summarizing it in about 5 seconds, a very complicated conflict. But basically, in Darfur, you had these forces that were essentially like local militias called the Janjaweed that were used by the government to basically attack various groups and various regions in Darfur, various ethnic groups, etc., and using them for the purposes of crushing dissent, essentially. So Bashir was a dictator who knew that he was tremendously unpopular, especially in those regions, and he needed a force to crush any potential protests, etc., which is exactly what they did. Of course, they carried out ethnic cleansing, targeted killings, all of the usual stuff. This is the Janjaweed of the early 2000s. That eventually evolves into what we now call the RSF, which is the rebranded name for the Janjaweed after they were incorporated into the government. So they had initially been kind of like local militias scattered around, eventually consolidated under the intelligence services of the government and become functionally a part of the military, though separate, a kind of quasi-military, quasi-paramilitary, or a parallel military, or however you want to look at that. So the RSF emerges out of that. The RSF, I'm fast forwarding quite a bit here, but the RSF basically develops its own power base. Its power base is in Darfur in Western Sudan. And the RSF essentially by 2023 challenges for power, challenges the army, which is led by a general named Burhan. Okay, so I'm grossly simplifying it. I did a Counterpunch Radio episode on this about, I don't know, 9, 10, 11 months ago, whenever the heck that was. You should maybe go over and check that one out. But anyway, I want to just focus on the major players here. So the RSF is led by a guy named Hemeti. Well, his name is Dagalo, but he's known as Hemeti. Okay, so the RSF is challenging the army. This is the nature of this war. You have this plane that we're looking at. Why would this plane be so important? Well, number one, it came from Uganda and it was registered to a company called Bar Aviation. And we're going to talk a little bit about Bar Aviation, but Bar Aviation basically helps us to understand the role that Israel plays, not only in Sudan, where Israel has long been a player, both in Sudan and in South Sudan, but really all throughout Africa and particularly in countries like Uganda. So the Israelis, who are, of course, conducting their genocide as we speak in Gaza, the Israelis are involved in this as well, though how deeply they're involved is a matter for some debate. And I'll illustrate that a little bit further here in a few minutes. So the plane itself it is owned by a company called Bar Aviation. It originates in Uganda, or is based in Uganda, and sources that are on the ground say that the plane was filled likely with weapons, most likely Russian rockets, Katyusha rockets, and that those weapons were destined for the RSF. Now, step back for a second and ask why this would be necessary. The answer is actually quite simple, because it's not the RSF, but the army that controls Sudanese airspace. It is the army that is able to, basically control with its air force all of Sudan's airspace. So to fly covertly into Sudan is not the easiest thing to do. More on that in a minute. The sources agree that the plane originated, though it's based in Uganda, that the plane actually originated in the United Arab Emirates. And now we're getting to the real key players here. The UAE is, I would say, inarguably the central player that is helping to fuel this war. Not the only one by any means, but the central one. And we're going to see how in just a second. What we see in this little episode of this plane back in August is an actually existing complicated network of supply lines stretching from not only Sudan, but into Chad, into Libya, into Uganda, the Central African Republic, and the entire region. Okay, that is what this is illustrating. And I'm going to go through all the details here in a minute of how it actually shows all of that. And if I'm speaking slow, it's because there's a lot of information here to digest, and I don't want to just gloss over some of the key background and context that a person needs. I'm not, I don't see myself like one of these YouTubers that just goes up and just talks and talks and talks and whatever, gets paid, I guess. Like, this is about research. This is about trying to understand what's happening and analyzing facts to try to put them together to understand more broadly not only what's happening in the region, but how is global politics shifting in the time that we're living in, because it's shifting quite rapidly. Anyway, let's get back to the conflict in Sudan. Estimated death toll of 12,000, obviously severely underestimated. In fact, there are many who say that the death toll even in Darfur is not even counted, and it could potentially be tens of thousands larger than that. So the displaced number is roughly 7. That is really people. Okay, now let's see here. The contending forces, on the one hand, you have the army, and on the other hand, you have the RSF. Now, the RSF has gone on a charm offensive, diplomatic and political charm offensive. At the same time, the military, the army, is now really kind of transformed from basically a junta that ousted Bashir and ousted many of his loyalists to now a vehicle for those same loyalists who are now trying to get themselves back into power, along with ultra conservative right-wing groups inside the country. That could mean any number of things. I'm not the world's foremost expert on the various political divides within Sudanese society, so I'm not going to go into all of that. Needless to say, as the article points out, the army is now a vehicle for the ultra conservative right, in addition to the sort of military junta. On the other hand, as I said, you have the RSF. The RSF has actually made tremendous gains in recent months, including in December, so just a couple of months ago, seizing the second city of Sudan, the second largest city of Wad Madani, after the army had abandoned it. And that has been a controversial subject in Sudan. I believe they're now having an investigation into who exactly ordered the retreat by the army. But anyway, the RSF took control of that city. The RSF should be understood as basically in ascendance right now. The army is faltering. There are internal divisions there. There's questions about the leadership, etc. The RSF, on the other hand, is ascendant, both militarily and politically. But let's ask why. Is it just because Hemeti is just such a brilliant politician and tactician that he's just able to outmaneuver the army with its 200,000 troops versus his 100,000 troops? I don't think so. And in fact, none of the regional experts seem to think so either. In fact, there's a general consensus that Hemeti and the RSF are ascendant primarily because of external backing, and in particular, the backing of the UAE. So, as I just mentioned, 2-to-1 advantage in numbers for the Sudanese army. But numbers don't tell the whole story, because the Sudanese army doesn't have all of the external forces backing it that the RSF does, although there are external forces that are playing both sides here. So like I said, extremely messy conflict. Now, although the army has the numbers advantage, the RSF has what you might call the qualitative fighting advantage. Although it's got half the number of troops, the RSF troops are battle hardened. They have fought through quite a lot, including carrying out massacres, including summary executions, including putting down dissent under in the time of Bashir, etc. These guys also essentially fulfilled a mercenary role on behalf of the UAE, fighting in the war in Yemen, fighting in the war in Libya. So when you think back to Libya of the last decade, the post-NATO, post-Gaddafi period, and you focus on the civil war there and the competing factions, I've done a number of videos on that, you see that the UAE was able to effect very real progress on the ground using proxy forces precisely like these Sudanese fighters from the RSF getting paid handsomely by the Emiratis to do their dirty work. That was happening in Libya. That was happening, and probably is still happening, in Yemen. So that and those are only two examples. The UAE is doing this in other places as well. The RSF are able to defeat the army in battles, but they're not able to do it without this external support. Now, interesting in this article, actually, let me just put this up real quick, just so we know what we're talking about here. Here's a map. If you see closely there, that region outlined in red, that is North Kordofan. That is the province where the plane landing happened. Now you see it's just to the west of Khartoum, the capital of the country, obviously strategically quite important to seize that territory. Now, the CIA, well, let's say this. The article cites, what's his name? Cameron Hudson, I believe is his name, and they call him former CIA. But of course, as anybody who knows a little bit about U.S. Dirty dealings and the CIA, there's really no such thing as former CIA, is there? Whether or not you're directly on the CIA's payroll, you're a CIA man, you speak for the CIA. It doesn't ever change. It was that way in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. It's that way today. The CIA is the CIA, and I personally don't buy into the former CIA moniker. But anyway, former CIA, I don't know, asset agent, analyst, probably, Cameron Hudson has some excellent observations here. Tells you something what the CIA is willing to divulge and why the CIA might be willing to do so. As I said, former CIA guy would never be publicly quoted in an article like this if it weren't at least tacitly approved by some elements within that gray, foggy mist that is U.S. intelligence. He says, quote, "I think the support coming from the UAE is very substantial." Okay, so here's the CIA basically telling you what we already know from the data, from the flight trackers, from all these other things, from regional experts, etc., confirming it, that it is the UAE that is providing the bulk of the support, and that everyone pretty much agrees on this. Now, the US government actually also implicated the Wagner Russian, the Russian version of Blackwater, and the Russian private military contractor, previously owned and operated by Yevgeny Prigozhin until he tragically lost his life in a plane crash. Who knows how that happened? Anyway, the US government implicates Wagner for, quote, supplying the RSF with surface to air missiles to fight against Sudan's army. Now, this is really interesting, and I'm going to just take a very, very quick aside to talk about the fact that this illustrates the extremely dangerous and sort of complicated role that Wagner was playing, because Wagner under Prigozhin was clearly getting paid and funneling weapons and other things across the border into Sudan. At the very same time, the Russian government has interests in backing the Sudanese military, which it has its own reasons for, including the long desired Russian port at Port Sudan and other factors. So interesting that here you see in Sudan, in fact, something like maybe a tension between the Kremlin and Wagner. And in fact, since Prigozhin's death, we have seen Wagner, quote unquote, dismantled, or maybe put more realistically, simply incorporated into the broader Russian military apparatus. In any event, supplying surface to air missiles into Sudan, the Wagner forces were also involved, of course, in extracting gold, minerals, carrying out security on behalf of regional governments. So Wagner playing a very dirty role as well. Now, Hemeti is not just a military commander. You see him again. I mean, you can see him right here. Look at the guy. He is obviously trying to put forward an image of being a politician first, a diplomat, the public face of Sudan. This is not somebody who wants to present himself as a general trying to, massacre his way into power. And in fact, we see this when we look at Hemeti's business dealings. He has a business empire, you might call it, with an array of different front organizations and stuff, all based in Dubai. Dubai, of course, being one of the Emirates. Okay, so now we see that the relationship is not just one where the UAE wants to wants to use the conflict in Sudan for its own political purposes. There are financial dealings, there are business relationships, there's a whole host of other things going on here. So Hemeti's business empire is based in Dubai. It is managed by his brother. His brother and he are close to the vice president of the UAE, Mansour bin Zayed, and they recently met with Mohammed bin Zayed, the leader of the UAE, in Abu Dhabi. Okay, or I shouldn't say recently. Actually, this was March 2023. Now, interesting of the timing here. Right before the war breaks out, they're up in UAE meeting with the leaders there. Now, did they get a green light from them? Was it just a feeling out kind of meeting? Obviously, I wasn't there, but I sure would love to have been a fly on the wall for that meeting. Not that I speak the language, but whatever. It's a separate issue. Sudanese gold that is coming out of mines controlled by the RSF is going directly to the UAE. It is traded there and then sent, of course, all over the world. I'm sure there's a vast laundering apparatus in place, but the point is, what you need to know is Hemeti controls the RSF. His brother is in Dubai, taking the gold that is sent from Sudan into the UAE and thereby helping to fund the RSF and to obviously line their pockets. Now, interesting part of this too, and since I mentioned Russia, I should bring them up again. We already know there's been several confirmed stories about the Wagner forces stealing gold from Sudan, shipping it back to Russia. as a way of Russia's countering the United States and European sanctions that were placed on it for its invasion of Ukraine. So, in many ways, Sudanese gold is basically being plundered by multiple countries, multiple parties for multiple reasons. Unfortunately, that's kind of the story of Africa for like 3, 4, 500 years, isn't it? It's a recycling or a sort of a replay of the same cycle over and over and over again, except that in cases in prior centuries, it wasn't countries like the UAE and Russia. And of course, just to back up for a second, this is not to say that the United States, the British, and the French are not carrying out all sorts of neocolonial crimes. They are. But in this case, where we're talking about Sudan, we need to know specifically which players are involved and how exactly they're involved. All right. So I already mentioned that Hemeti's brother runs the business. The UAE has major interests in Sudan. And as I said, it's not just to kind of burnish their, diplomatic and political reputation. They use the fighters, as I mentioned. The UAE, they're not putting up a military of their own. Their military forces, their fighters that they can deploy, they come from places like Sudan, and they go to places like Yemen and Libya. That's how the UAE is doing power projection, hard power projection, using a country like Sudan in this way. They're also buying up, and these are major investors from the UAE, not just like the government, but, billionaires and stuff. It's that the Dubai is full of that, right? These guys are coming in, they're buying up agricultural land in Sudan. Why? Because they have major food security issues in the UAE. And the people in the UAE, although they keep, they're flush with oil money and all of the rest of it, it's not exactly the most hospitable place on earth, and certainly one that's going to get ever worse as climate change worsens. And so they're obviously looking at a host of reasons why they need to secure lush fertile agricultural land. And that's exactly what they're buying in Sudan. They also see the importation of livestock from Sudan. You want to go to Dubai and eat at one of the, premier steakhouses, ask yourself, where'd that meat come from? It certainly wasn't raised in the UAE. Tens of billions of dollars that the UAE has invested in port projects in Sudan. Now think about this one for a second. Port projects in Sudan. Take a look at the map. Oh, I don't think do I have the whole map here? Let's see. Take a look at, you see a little piece of it. Take a look at the map. Those ports, including like the town right here, Port of Sudan. I mean, it's not a tremendous coastline, but it is strategically critical. It is on the Red Sea. It is leading towards the Suez Canal, the Bab al-Mandeb Strait. We see every day, it seems like, news stories about attacks by Houthis against Western shipping interests, etc. The Mandeb Strait is one of the most critical choke points anywhere on earth. So to have control of ports along the Red Sea and also be able to project your power and influence in a place like Yemen, and of course the UAE itself being located in beyond the strait, you can see just geographically why the Emiratis would be pouring tens of billions into these ports. So you have the UAE looking at all of these various economic and political reasons for why they want to back the RSF and why they're so invested in Sudan. But in fact, I would say probably the most important reason, that's even more important than money, even more important than influence, it is about survival. And what do I mean by that? The UAE, much like Qatar, much like Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, the UAE is a monarchy, a feudal, backwards, reactionary regime. Despite the glitz and the glamour, despite all of the rest of that, it is a monarchy. It is reactionary and feudal in its nature, and they desperately must crush any semblance of democratic change anywhere in the region. And Sudan was actually, in many ways, ground zero for precisely that. In 2019, and after the ouster of Bashir, there was a genuine grassroots driven democracy movement. We could argue about whether it was doomed to fail from the beginning because of its tactics, whether it was, whether the leaderlessness of the grassroots came into conflict with the more organized structures of the unions and other forces, the doctors, the teachers, etc., who all came out. All of those questions can be discussed. But the bottom line is there was a pro-democracy movement that was seeking to establish something like a transition to democracy in Sudan after decades of rule by the military. That, more than anything else, had to be stopped. And it was stopped. The army came in, overthrew the government, ousted them by 2021. That army is then attacked by the RSF. And now we have the sort of dynamic that is playing out today. The UAE cannot allow democracy anywhere. This is part of the reason why they support the kinds of regimes and the kinds of actors that they support in places like Libya. The UAE had to support Haftar, had to support a military dictatorship because they could not sit by and let Libya actually have anything resembling a democratic process, whatever that might look like. The same was true in Tunisia. The same is true in Algeria. The same is true in Chad. Okay, the UAE is doing all of that. I haven't even gotten to Chad yet, but I will in just a minute. Crushing democracy, absolutely. Oh, Egypt. I didn't even mention Egypt. Remember that Egypt has been under the control of what amounts to a civilian military dictatorship now for, 11 years or so. That couldn't have happened without the backing of the UAE, in particular, of course, backing them against their rivals in Qatar. Anyway, I can't get into all of that because that goes into the Muslim Brotherhood question and Morsi and the democratic election in Egypt, etc. We don't have time to get into all of that. For now, just know the UAE is heavily invested in crushing any semblance of democracy anywhere. And Sudan was one of those places where it was coming up. So what's happened now, of course, now that the war has dragged on, the RSF now presents itself as the democracy movement. They present themselves as the defenders of democracy, and they have, obviously the Janjaweed and now the RSF is nothing like democracy movement. In fact, they're guilty of war crimes, etc., crimes against humanity and on and on. But in the context of this civil war, what we've actually seen is that the RSF has shifted its talking points and presents itself as the democratic, as the representative of democratic processes. Okay. So this is really very, 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 very important to understand. The RSF now even has some support from former leaders of the democracy movement, including the former Prime Minister Hamdok, who is now allied with Hemeti, interestingly enough. Okay, even though he was ousted by Hemeti, or Hemeti was part of the group that ousted him. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how the weapons move. And I think I have, well, here's the quote about the UAE. Throughout the war, Sudanese army officers and officials aligned with the army have spoken in private about what they perceive to be the malign influence of the UAE and its support for their enemy. On the 28th of November, this finally became public when General Yasser Al-Attah blasted the Emirates in a speech, blah, blah, blah. We have information from intelligence, military intelligence, and the diplomatic circuit that the UAE sends planes to support the Janjaweed, Al-Attah said, referring to the RSF by the name in which they emerged. So that's what they're alleging. That's what they're saying. Let's just look at this real quick as well. So here's this analyst talking about the illicit trade networks that were flowing from Libya, eastern Libya, again, controlled by Haftar. Former, in the 1980s, former CIA, more recently a proxy of the Russians and the UAE and others, during the civil war in Libya when he was fighting against the forces in Tripoli that were backed by Erdogan and the Turks. So they were running these illicit trade networks, running fuel. Captagon, which, if you recall, that's the amphetamine that is known as the jihadi pill, the one that supposedly makes these fighters just not care whether they live or die and not care about pain and so forth. Hashish, gold, stolen cars, people trafficking, and aid, all going through these networks coming through eastern Libya, but it doesn't stop there. I'm gonna get into that in just a second. In Sudan, let me get rid of this. Where the heck is that? There. In Sudan, what we have is all air space is controlled by the army. So that means that running weapons into Sudan is not as simple as loading up a plane and flying it in. And in fact, they were using Libya and flying out of Libya into the Central African Republic, at which point they were offloading from the planes, loading the weapons into cars and trucks, and driving it from Central African Republic into Western Sudan, just over the border. Okay, now, what does that tell us? It tells us quite a lot. Number one, it tells us just how elaborate these networks are. And maybe even more importantly, it tells us how other players give that, whether they're tacit or overt approval, and in this case, the government of the Central African Republic. But we have to understand the government of the Central African Republic is not really the government of the Central African Republic. It is a proxy of the Russians. In fact, Touadera, who's the president of the Central African Republic, is entirely dependent upon Wagner and the Russians for his security. For security, not only for himself, and more importantly, for I guess you could say, security against the armed groups that would oust him were it not for the Russian presence. Okay, so now the UAE is helping for weapons to flow from Libya into the CAR, from the CAR into Sudan. At the same time, the Russians have Wagner forces in CAR carrying out their own, massacres and all the other shit that the Wagner forces do. Do you believe that this was done without Russia's knowledge, without Wagner's knowledge, when they have their boots on the ground? I think it is impossible. The only logical conclusion here is that the UAE and the Russians are essentially working towards the same goal, and that's borne out by the evidence. They are working to arm and support the RSF in the hopes that when the RSF seizes power, they, not the West or the Turks or anybody else, they will be the primary players there. So Hemeti himself is close with Haftar, and in fact, supposedly, according to some reports, so close that they broke their Ramadan fasts together last year. So interesting. And let me just side note really quickly to talk about Haftar. I mentioned, I think if you're listening to me, you probably know that Haftar was a CIA asset in the 1980s when the Reagan administration wanted to use him to topple Gaddafi. Of course, that failed, and Haftar had to be the little CIA, payroll recipient, welfare recipient in Virginia for many, many years, until he was shipped back to Libya after the overthrow of Gaddafi in hopes that he would seize power. That didn't happen, thanks to Turkey's intervention. That is a story for another day. So the Haftar family cultivated these trade networks, and they are the ones who helped to preserve them in eastern Libya into Sudan. And I mentioned all of the things that have been moved. The Libya supply routes have now shifted, however. And a lot of that has to do, as the article points out, and again, I'm citing everything from this article. This is really, really important article. I would recommend everybody go check out How the UAE Kept the Sudan War Raging from AfricanArguments.org. Anyway, the supply routes out of Libya have shifted primarily because of the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council put in place an arms embargo and also a monitoring, I guess you could say, mechanism, right? Now, that means then that a country like UAE and a country like Russia isn't just going to simply flout that and fly arms in. No, They then have to move away from using Libya in that way and find a different way of doing it. And in fact, that's where the whole Central African Republic angle comes in. The fact that they're not able to fly directly from Libya into Sudan means they bring the CAR into the fold. Now, Darfur, the western region of Sudan, borders the Central African Republic. As I said, the president, Touadera, totally dependent upon Wagner. Wagner's been running weapons. Now, here's one of the spokespeople for the Central African Republic opposition, the organized opposition against Touadera, says, quote, Wagner and the Central African Republic's government are keen to secure the situation of their ally in Sudan, which is the RSF. So they have handed huge quantities of weapons to the RSF through the Sudanese CAR border, close quote. Now, this is really important too, to understand that the Central African Republic plays this role as a conduit, but so does Chad. Okay, now, I'm sorry to keep doing a little sidestep here, but we have to remember what happened in Chad recently. Chad was ruled by the dictatorship of Idris Deby for decades. I think 30 plus years it was. Deby was killed when he was visiting the front lines of their conflict with armed groups. That was, I don't know, what was that, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago? I can't remember now. Time has flattened and elongated in ways that make it impossible to remember when the hell things happened. But it happened fairly recently. So Deby's son, Idris Deby, is the one who was killed. Deby's son then kind of took over in a transitional role, Mahamat Deby. Okay, so Mahamat Deby meets with an advisor to Mohammed bin Zayed, the ruler of the UAE, and with Hemeti's brother, remember, who runs the business empire for Hemeti in the UAE. So here's our UAE connection. These guys come to Chad in July and visit with Deby. Now, the reporting goes that the UAE has given or has promised to give Deby more than $1 billion. Why? Obviously, to flip Chad to support the RSF. Chad's interest, in theory, should be the stability that would come with the Sudanese government, but no, they're going to flip them using UAE money. This is how the UAE is flexing its power. Soft power is something they understand from a cultural perspective. The Saudis understand it as well. Look at all the big time boxing that's going on in Saudi Arabia, Live Golf, the World Cup in Qatar. These countries, they know how to do soft power now. And here you see the UAE throwing money around to affect real change on the ground. So a lot of the money is flowing into Chad, and it's actually flowing into a town called Amjaras, which is actually where the Deby family comes from. There were flight trackers that were tracking the various flights coming into and out of the UAE and Uganda and Chad, etc. Those flight trackers are now gone. Supposedly, they deleted their accounts because they were fearful of certain things that might happen, or I forget what the quote was, no longer safe to do this kind of reporting. I wonder who came and intimidated them about tracking specific aircraft flying over specific areas of Africa. So the New York Times actually has reported that Amjaras is the heart of a, quote, elaborate covert operation run by the UAE to back the RSF. Just because it was in the New York Times doesn't make it so, but the New York Times, I think, is pretty dead on here. It's clear. We can see this, and satellite imagery seems to indicate that as well. There's video showing flights. There's, of course, the video we played at the beginning. This video, I think, is an example, maybe the one example that has surfaced publicly, an example of the flights that are flying directly into Sudan, right? So they're not only using this overland route, they're also flying directly in using this cargo plane. Now, inside of Sudan, the planes can't be tracked. So there's a motivation for them to use certain aircraft to fly weapons into Sudan where they can then be distributed to the RSF. Now, we talked about planes. I mentioned it at the beginning. Let's take a step back and look at the company that owns that plane that we saw in that video. The company I mentioned is Bar Aviation. They own the plane, and it is registered in Uganda. Now, Bar Aviation is a company owned by a man named Barak Orland, an Israeli businessman who's lived in Uganda for more than 20 years. Israeli businessman living in Uganda for more than 20 years. What do we think he's doing in Uganda? So, Barak Orland is close to the president, President Yoweri Museveni, longtime strongman president in Uganda. But reporting indicates that Barak Orland is not just a businessman. He is well known among human rights activists and analysts of various kinds. He's well known to be an arms dealer. Okay, so this guy has been chilling in Uganda for 20 years, married a Ugandan, is very close to the Ugandan general Muhoozi Kainerugaba. Muhoozi Kainerugaba is Yoweri Museveni's son, and also the one who's most likely being groomed to take over when Museveni dies, which he inevitably will here in the next few years. I don't know how old Yoweri Museveni is. He's got to be in his late 70s, 80s, got to be. I don't know offhand. Anyway, here you have Bar Aviation, an Israeli or a company run by an Israeli, likely running guns into Sudan, which is a country that the Israelis have a history of running weapons into. So, Bar Aviation made flights from Uganda to eastern Chad. Okay, again, think about what I just said about the Chad connection, using Chad as a means to, or rather, using the money as a means of flipping Chad. Chad has now seemingly flipped and is now potentially a new corridor for accessing the Sudanese war. Okay, according to an Israeli analyst and advisor to the Israeli government on matters related to Sudan, quote, the suspicion is they were bringing in supplies from the UAE. There are business dealings between Hemeti and Ugandans which fit into the financial assistance the UAE gave Chad. Close quote. Dizzying relations, web of relations here, but pick it apart and it makes quite a bit of sense. Okay. The UAE is giving money to Chad. At the same time, Uganda is looking at the UAE as an investor. I'm going to get to that in a second. All of this is with an eye to making the situation on the ground in Sudan to their best interest. So you have essentially 3 or 4 overlapping agendas here that are all kind of centered around making sure that the RSF is victorious in Sudan. So Museveni, for his part, is maintaining relations with both sides. And in fact, that's something Museveni has done for a long time, trying to play nice with the United States while playing footsie with the Chinese, while working with the Russians and all sorts of different things. This is Museveni's sort of modus operandi. So Museveni is maintaining relations with both sides. How is he doing it with the UAE? Selling prime farmland in Uganda to UAE investors as a way of taking advantage of the Sudanese civil war. What does Museveni want? Museveni wants Uganda to be the investment hub for the UAE. And I keep saying the UAE, just a reminder, that is not only Dubai, that's also Abu Dhabi and the other Emirates. This is a vast, vast wealth that these rulers like MBZ, Mohammed bin Zayed, sit on. Okay, so selling farmland, trying to turn it into a trading hub. The Sudanese army, as I already mentioned, is already calling out the UAE for their role. They're calling out the fact that the UAE is essentially the reason that the RSF can continue to operate. Okay, so I mean, I'm already approaching 50 minutes now, so I have to try to wrap this up. But I just want to point out a couple of things. So let's just show them again. There they are, the champs, Museveni and Hemeti, right? Hemeti presenting himself to be the the next president, the likely next president of Sudan. That's how he sees his role. The Sudanese army, on the other hand, is trying to blast that infrastructure. We already have reports that they have shelled all of those airstrips that were previously being used. So this is now an open secret. And it's important to understand this because, as I already mentioned, the crushing of Sudanese democracy, of the democracy movement, was a huge blow to the entire continent of Africa. More important even than just Sudan, what we see is that Africa is very much a battleground, not just for the traditional colonial powers. It's not just the US and the French and the British and the Germans and all of these others that are trying to exploit Africa as they did since the Berlin Conference and well before that. No, no, no. Now we have new players, the UAE and the Russians and Turkey, who I'm not talking about in this video, but Turkey's very much a big player as well. All of these sort of tangled web of connections and relations, you have to sort of pick through all of that to understand what's going on in the region, to understand why this fucking war, this dreadful, ghastly war, just goes on, despite the fact that really there's very little reason for it. Unfortunately for the people of Sudan, they're further from democracy now than they have been in quite a long time. Those halcyon days in 2019 and 2020 are long gone now. And the days and years of darkness in Sudan are quite likely. It's really important that we understand this. And we also, for those of us in the United States and elsewhere in the West, we should understand what's going on in this country because there's a sizable Sudanese and South Sudanese diaspora in our own countries. We should understand how Sudan and the war in Sudan is affecting what's going on in the Horn of Africa. Sudan is one of the 3 countries deeply involved in the dispute over the Nile, access to the Nile water, thanks to the grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which the Ethiopians have built. So there's a lot of dynamics going on in the Horn of Africa, in East Africa, that have to be understood. And unfortunately, Sudan is really at the sort of epicenter of all of that. Everybody's got blood on their hands. This is a dirty, dirty war. And we need to recognize who's involved. And I should mention this. The United States seemingly has very little to do with what's going on in Sudan. Now, that doesn't mean there's not covert things going on that haven't been reported. There could be. But as it stands, the 2 sides in Sudan's war, they don't come to Washington looking for support. They're not going to London looking for support. They're going to Dubai. They're going to Moscow, if not directly, indirectly. They're going to these places, to Turkey, which has, as I said, interests in Sudan as well. There are other players involved. This is the new world that we live in. It is not the world of the 20th century or even the world of the early 21st century in the post 9/11 period. This is a new world with many competing imperialisms, and it's our duty to oppose all of them. That's it for today. More to come. Thanks for the support, guys.